Hello, welcome. So happy to see you all. Welcome to the Critical Whiteness in Picture Books workshop. My name is Paige Pagan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program specialist for social justice books at Teaching for Change. I'm happy to be one of the facilitators this evening alongside Dr. Marilisa Jimenez Garcia, author, associate professor of English, founding director of the Institute for Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, and chair of Ed Justice at Lehigh University, and Vanessa Williams, program manager of the DC Area Educators for Social Justice. So before we begin, we would like to know who's in the room. Please drop in the chat your name, your role, where you're zooming in from, and what resources you consult when teaching about whiteness and race relations. And as those awesome introductions are rolling in, I'd like to show the agenda for our hour-long session today. We'll start with some brief introductions, then we'll move into an overview of critical whiteness studies from Dr. Jimenez Garcia. We'll then go into breakout sessions. We'll return for a group Jamboard activity, and then we'll have our closing and evaluations. So as you can see, we have a lot of good stuff to cover in a limited amount of time. So let's get started. Teaching for Change is a nonprofit organization located in the DC area with a mission to provide educators and parents with the tools to create schools where students learn to read, write, and change the world. By drawing direct connections to real world issues, Teaching for Change encourages teachers and students to question and rethink the world inside and outside their classrooms, build a more equitable, multicultural society, and become active global citizens. Teaching for Change offers professional development, develops lessons, and curates resources to help classroom teachers supplement pre-K through 12 curriculum through our various areas of focus, projects, and initiatives, two of which are co-hosting this workshop today. Have some background noise. Okay, so one of these is Social Justice Books, a project of Teaching for Change with the goal of identifying and promoting the best multicultural and socially and racially just books. Social Justice Books offers more than 80 carefully curated lists of recommended books for children, young adults, and educators on a variety of themes that all address representation and people's history. Social Justice Books also hosts a database of critical book reviews and recommended articles on multicultural children's literature and critical literacy. And now I'll hand it over to Vanessa.
Thanks for that, Paige. Hi, y'all. My name is Vanessa Williams, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the program manager for DC Area Educators for Social Justice. When I'm explaining this program to folks who are unfamiliar, although I'm looking at the participant list for tonight, it seems like many of you are already pretty heavily involved. But for those of you who are a little unaware, I tend to think about the work that we do as falling into three different buckets. One of those is our network of pre-K through 12 social justice educators that meet monthly to share lessons, resources, plan, and attend events, and simply connect with one another on social justice education in the DC area. I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat that will direct you to some of those, some more information on those things. I also think about how we amplify and find opportunities to localize Teaching for Change programming and campaigns in the DC area with events like our Black Lives Matter at School Curriculum Fair or workshops designed to uplift teaching Central America. Lastly, I'd like to briefly note signature programming in the DC area, such as Film Fest DC. This year, April 21st through May 1st, there's still time to request a classroom visit or request to participate. We're going to drop that link in the chat, or our Teach to Beat program, which brings Go in the classroom. And another plug, we're also scheduling visits for the remainder of this academic year into fall 2022. So check the chat for an opportunity to learn more about Teach to Beat and to schedule a classroom visit. And I'm going to pass that over to Dr. J to talk a little bit about ICRES. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. And I've worked with Teaching for Change for years now, so I super value the space. So thankful to have a partnership with you all through ICRES and social justice books. So I represent ICRES today, the Education Justice Initiative, the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies that I helped found with actually student activists at Lehigh. And the Ed Justice Project in particular, the initiative is working with responsive workshops informed by research. Youth literature and racial justice is what we're looking at through author talks, free books for classroom libraries as well. We're also looking at ways of bringing ethnic studies into your K through 12 classroom. We've worked on a series of Puerto Rican Latino studies. I'm from Puerto Rico, so I don't know if anybody here is, but hey there. Puerto Rican Latino studies in K through 12, and then also ethnic studies approaches to research relationships with communities of color, right? I'm actually coming to you from Baltimore, so not too far away from DC. So happy to be here with you. And I'm just gonna go right into the presentation on critical whiteness and picture books. It's a little lag, okay. So what is critical race theory? Beyond what Ted Cruz has told us, of course. Ted Cruz keeps telling us what it is. But what is critical race theory? So today we are going to be looking at a very basic overview of CRT and its offshoot, critical white studies, as a lens for thinking about the three picture books we're gonna discuss here, right? We hope that this overview will help you recognize some of the language of CRT and critical white studies and what it helps you see and process in your work as an educator and possible convos you might have with your classes in the future. Again, what is CRT? So Delgado and Stefanik in 2017 write that critical race theory is, quote, a collection of activists and scholars engaging in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. It is a study of systemic racism, looking at, quote, history, setting, group, and self-interest, emotions, and the unconscious. So it's not law in itself. Critical race theory examines and questions the foundations of the liberal order. So it questioned things like legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the, quote, neutral principles of constitutional law. So it was revolutionary because it dared to question actually the ways that we even talked about the law itself. So here are some forerunners that brought us critical race theory. And it's a movement that really gets cemented in the 1990s in terms of the work in this area. So important thinkers in the CRT field include Derek Bell, who is credited as founding the field with his work on the bell curve, which helped demonstrate one of the tenets of CRT, interest convergence. The big idea with interest convergence is that in order for policy reform to be approved, the dominant white group has to have some kind of buy-in or benefit. For example, some people point to affirmative action as an instance of interest convergence. For example, mostly white women benefited from those policies. Bell later cements his legacy in the field by authoring the article, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory, for the University of Illinois Law Review in 1995. One of the basic contributions of this article was that his demonstration of how whiteness operates as a source of legal property or contract in US policy. Property that is often violently protected when those outside of whiteness challenge its hold. Quote, some positions have been historically oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized, and all this not accidentally. Conversely, the law simultaneously and systematically privileges subjects who are white. So CRT begins to grow and reach into other fields, including education. And I put some popular terms up, usually in terms of the ways that it comes up in our culture, like counter storytelling, master narrative, intersectionality, whiteness, the word whiteness itself. One of the folks who really helped in terms of bringing this to education was Gloria Ladson-Billings. So she's also here on this slide, known for her work in culturally relevant pedagogy. She writes the article, Just What is Critical Race Theory and What is it doing in a nice field like education? And this is an article that comes out in 1998. In her article, Ladson-Billings asks educators to consider the role race has on one's access to democracy and education because of the bond, quote, between the law and racial power. She also takes on the role that curriculum plays in maintaining a mentality of white supremacy as a master script. Now, let's look at the CRT tenets and see how they have been adapted to and for education. Important that we note also the importance CRT places on these as a whole. For example, look at the way it emphasizes intersectionality and elevating unique voices of color. So if we're doing CRT, we're not just looking at race, we're looking at gender, we're looking at all these systems of oppression, and we're elevating unique voices of color. In education, we see how this is translated to the centrality of experiential knowledge in a system which excluded communities of color as knowledge makers for so long. So tenants must work together in order to do CRT and accomplish the goals of racial justice. The tenets and conversations on race and racialization prompted the growth of other legal frameworks such as LATCRIT, Latino Studies Critical Race Theory, Queer Crit, and Critical White Studies. Today, we are going to focus more on critical white studies and some of the basic concepts it amplifies in our teaching. For example, Bell writes that working toward racial justice means that white subjects are encouraged to, quote, overthrow their white privilege. As mentioned previously, CRT unearthed whiteness as a form of property in the law, as a mentality, and as a master narrative or official script in social order. It is important to see why these various levels are important. Let's see. It's important to see why they have different levels are important, because we need to know where privilege, if we talk about white privilege, is coming from. And also we need to understand how it's protected and how it's constructed. If white subjects are to participate in CRT and critical whiteness, it also means that these white subjects are encouraged to, quote, overthrow their white privilege. And I think it's also important here to talk about how it's not just that whiteness is also something we need to talk about in our communities of color, right? So it's not just in like a predominantly white group. Okay, so what does this have to do with picture books? What does this mean for us as educators evaluating and sharing picture books through the lens of racial justice? And more specifically, through the lens of CRT and critical whiteness. Picture books as children's literature have been shown to act as a mirror for example, in our world. For example, Rudim Sims Bishop gave us the helpful metaphor of children's books as, quote, mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, where children should see their lives reflected and the lives of others. Years before, the Council on Interracial Books for Children also used the metaphor to say more specifically that children's books also help us uncover our own biases in our society at the time, even our communities of color. What are we reflecting back to our young people when we tell stories? Also in our society where whiteness itself is sometimes never even seen as a racial experience, how can picture books help us uncover whiteness itself? And to go back to critical whiteness, how can we look at whiteness in its various manifestations, such as a form of legal property, a mentality, or an official script? And now we will go to breakout rooms.
Great. And before we do so, I want to thank Dr. Jimenez Garcia for that amazing overview. So thank you so much. And before we move on to our breakout room discussions, analyzing our focus text through the lens of critical whiteness, I'd like to offer a brief synopsis of each text. So the discussion guide for these texts are in the chat, so you have access to that, and you also have access to each of the individual excerpts. The first text is Not My Idea, a book about whiteness by Anastasia Higginbotham. It's dedicated to fighting against racial injustice by acknowledging the forces of whiteness. Higginbotham seeks to teach children that when adults hide the truth about racism in America, they contribute to its perpetuation. In order to avoid being complicit too, Higginbotham teaches children that they can learn about the true history of America and recognize racially motivated behaviors in their own families and communities. Although calling out racism is hard, Higginbotham reassures children that racial justice is possible only if we're honest with each other and with ourselves. The second text is Race Cars by Jenny Devaney. It's a children's book about white privilege created to help parents and educators facilitate tough conversations about race, privilege, and oppression. Written by a clinical social worker and child therapist with experience in anti-bias training, and edited by a diversity expert, Race Cars tells the story of two best friends, a white car and a black car, that have different experiences and face different rules when entering the same race. And our last text is Mississippi Morning. In this book, it's the middle of the Great Depression, but James William still enjoys his life in rural Mississippi. His happiness starts to unravel when he discovers the fire that burned down the local preacher's house wasn't an accident, it was actually a hate crime. When his friend Leroy tells him about the Klan and their hanging tree, James William has a hard time grasping this harsh reality until an unexpected encounter brings the issue a bit close to home. So before we enter breakout rooms, just a bit on expectations. Each breakout room is dedicated to a discussion of one of the three focus texts. In the chat, again, there's the discussion guide for the picture books. You'll know which book your group is meant to discuss by referring to your breakout room name. If you need, we recommend taking about 3 minutes to review the excerpts of your breakout room's focus text first. This is intended to be a free-form conversation, of course, but we do invite you to refer to the guiding questions for conversation starters. And just a reminder, as always, that this is a safe and inclusive space. And now we will move on to the breakout rooms.
Actually, Paige, before we move into the breakout rooms, we have a couple minutes for questions, if there are any regarding Dr. J's remarks or about, well, just anything as far as like the next phase of today's workshop. Questions about that. You can unmute or raise your hand. We'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, please.
I have a question about how do you share a definition of critical race theory for children to understand what it means? We're reading Stamped for kids in my classroom, and so I introduced the book by saying that in some states it would be illegal for me to read it to them. And then all I did was go into some articles that gave me the most kid-friendly like explanation. But where would you suggest like to look for that so that students can understand more like upper elementary school, like what that means?
Yeah, there's actually a person's name that came to mind, and actually I met her through Teaching for Change in a workshop I went to, and her name is Garcia. I don't know if you've heard of Laleña, but she has a great picture book that came out not too long ago, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's actually used in the Black Lives Matter curriculum fair and in the curriculum, also the in schools, Black Lives Matter in School national movement. So I don't remember the name of the picture book. I'm sorry about that, but I do remember her, obviously. And actually, she's a consultant, and she's actually given some workshops where she really goes into like how she works even with early childhood and explaining and how quickly they understand also. But I think one of the big things I've heard her, and I've done myself with kids, with younger children, I should say, is like when we're talking about critical race theory, we're talking about not just like personal, that personal like racism, right? Like, I don't like you because you're XYZ, but that it's when someone has power, like when it's someone who can, like someone who's in the government and they write a law that says that you have the right to be mean, to someone legally, basically. So she talks about like institutional, right, versus interpersonal. And there are some moments in that picture book that actually illustrate that. So illustrate those concepts. And then I would also say we're gonna have some additional resources that go out after the workshop. And there's the book by Tiffany Jackson, which is called This Book is Anti-Racist. And I love that one too, even for adults, let me tell you. Because some of this stuff too, like for us, like just to break down how complex it is sometimes. But I love about that is like, it's got the graphics and kind of like a comic book lens, but it's really breaking down like, this is what this means. This is what that means. This is what intersectionality means. And it's really complete in terms of also including some of those other folks that we were talking about, like the LATCRIT, Queer Crit, right? Some of these other groups that have also said, well, what about us? So those are some people that I would recommend that help give you a working definition for our younger folks.
Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?